Thomas Miller stood at the dock in Boston Harbor, clutching a worn letter in his trembling hands. The year was 1847, and the 24-year-old carpenter had just received news that would change his life forever. His Uncle Henry, whom he barely remembered from childhood, had died suddenly in the Oregon Territory, leaving behind a timber business and a most unusual condition in his will. The letter from the territorial lawyer was clear, but shocking. Thomas would inherit his uncle's profitable sawmill and vast forest lands, but only if he married within 6 months of his uncle's death. The catch that made his stomach turn was even more specific. He had to marry a woman from the local Native American tribe that his uncle had worked closely with for years. The marriage was meant to honor a peace agreement his uncle had made with the tribal chief, ensuring continued cooperation between the settlers and the indigenous people. Thomas had never been west of Pennsylvania. He knew nothing about Native Americans except the wild stories he'd heard in taverns and newspapers. Most of those stories painted them as dangerous savages, though he'd always wondered if such tales were true. Now he faced an impossible choice: remain in Boston working for barely enough to survive, or travel 3,000 miles to marry a complete stranger from a culture he didn't understand. His mother wept when he told her about the inheritance. She begged him not to go, fearing she'd never see her only son again. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. "You'll be scalped before you even meet this woman," warned his drinking companion Jake. "Those people can't be trusted. They'll take your uncle's money and leave you dead in the woods." But Thomas had little to lose in Boston. He worked 16 hours a day building furniture for wealthy families, earning barely enough to rent a tiny room above a bakery. His hands were permanently stained with wood polish, and his back ached constantly from hunching over his workbench. The promise of owning land and a business was too tempting to ignore, even with the strange marriage requirement. After 3 sleepless nights, Thomas made his decision. He sold his few possessions, bought passage on a ship heading to California, and began the long journey west. The voyage around Cape Horn took 4 months, and Thomas spent most of it seasick and terrified. During the calmer moments, he tried to imagine what his future wife would look like. Would she speak English? Would she hate him for being forced into this arrangement? Would they ever find any happiness together? When the ship finally reached San Francisco, Thomas felt both relief and dread. He still had weeks of overland travel to reach the Oregon Territory. As he bought supplies for the next leg of his journey, other travelers shared their own stories about Native Americans. Some spoke of kind people who had helped them when they were lost or hungry. Others told frightening tales of raids and conflicts. Thomas didn't know what to believe anymore. The stagecoach ride north was bumpy and uncomfortable, but Thomas barely noticed. His mind raced with questions about what he would find at his destination. The lawyer's letter had mentioned that the tribal chief had already chosen a suitable bride for him, a young woman named Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her language. That was all he knew about the person who would become his wife. The Oregon forest grew thicker and taller around him. Thomas wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The trees were unlike anything he'd ever seen, massive trunks that seemed to touch the sky, creating a green canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. This wild, beautiful land would either become his home or his grave. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Pete, noticed Thomas's nervous fidgeting. "First time in Indian country?" he asked with a knowing smile. When Thomas nodded, Pete continued, "Well, I've been running this route for 10 years, and I can tell you something most folks back east don't know. The tribes up here aren't like the war parties you hear about in the newspapers. Chief Running Bear's people are peaceful traders. They've been good neighbors to the white settlers, long as everyone keeps their word." This gave Thomas some comfort, but his anxiety remained high. What if Ayana refused to marry him? What if the tribal customs were completely foreign to him? What if he could never learn to fit in with her people? The questions swirled in his mind as the stagecoach rolled deeper into the wilderness, carrying him toward a future he couldn't imagine. When they finally reached the small settlement near his uncle's sawmill, Thomas felt like he'd traveled to another world. The town consisted of just a dozen wooden buildings surrounded by endless forest, Everyone seemed to know about his arrival and his unusual situation. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with pity. The local preacher shook his head sadly and muttered something about unholy unions. Thomas checked into the town's only inn and spent his first night staring at the ceiling, listening to the strange sounds of the forest. Tomorrow he would meet the tribal leaders and see his bride-to-be for the first time. His entire future depended on what happened in the next few days, and he had never felt more alone or uncertain in his life. The morning sun filtered through the tall pines as Thomas walked toward the meeting place, his boots crunching on fallen needles and small twigs. His hands were sweaty despite the cool forest air, and his heart hammered against his ribs. The tribal council had agreed to meet him at a clearing halfway between the town and their village, a neutral ground where both cultures could come together safely. Thomas had spent the early morning hours pacing his small room at the inn, changing his clothes 3 times and trying to calm his nerves. The innkeeper's wife, a kind woman named Margaret, had given him some advice over breakfast. "Just be respectful and honest," she'd said while pouring his coffee. "Chief Running Bear is a fair man, and he loved your uncle dearly. Henry always spoke highly of the tribe's honor and wisdom." When Thomas reached the clearing, he saw several Native Americans already waiting for him. They stood in a semicircle near a small fire, dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and items they'd traded from white settlers. Chief Running Bear was easy to identify. A tall, dignified man in his 50s with long, gray-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes. His presence commanded immediate respect without being threatening. "You are Henry's nephew," the chief said, in clear English, stepping forward with his hand extended. "I am Running Bear. Your uncle spoke of you many times. He said you were a good man with skilled hands and an honest heart." Thomas shook the chief's hand, surprised by the warmth in his voice and the firmness of his grip. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me, sir. I know this situation is unusual for everyone involved." Running Bear nodded thoughtfully. "Your uncle made a promise to my people before he died. He said that whoever inherited his business would continue the partnership between our communities. Marriage creates the strongest bond between families and tribes. It shows that you are committed to staying here and working with us, not just taking what you can and leaving." The chief explained that Thomas's uncle had been more than just a business partner to the tribe. Henry had helped them negotiate fair prices for their timber, had hired many tribal members at his sawmill, and had even learned their language and customs. When conflicts arose with other settlers, Henry had always stood up for the tribe's rights. In return, they had protected his property and shared their knowledge of the forest. "But I should meet her first," Thomas said nervously. "The woman who would be my wife. I want to be sure she agrees to this arrangement willingly." Running Bear smiled for the first time since Thomas had arrived. "Ayana is my youngest daughter. She is 22 years old and has been helping her mother prepare for this meeting since we received news of Henry's death. She wishes to speak with you herself." The chief gestured toward the trees, and Thomas saw a young woman emerge from behind a large pine. His breath caught in his throat as she walked toward them with quiet confidence. Ayana was nothing like what he had expected. She was beautiful, in a natural, understated way, with long dark hair braided with small wildflowers, and wearing a dress that appeared to be made from soft deerskin, decorated with colorful beadwork. But what struck Thomas most was her eyes. They were intelligent and curious, not fearful or resigned as he had worried they might be. She looked directly at him as she approached, studying his face with the same intensity that he was studying hers. "I wanted to see the man who might become my husband," Ayana said in accented but clear English. "My father has told me many good things about your Uncle Henry. He was like family to us. But you are not Henry. I need to know what kind of man you are." Thomas was impressed by her directness. He had expected a shy, submissive woman who would simply accept whatever the men in her tribe decided. Instead, he found himself facing someone who clearly had her own opinions and wasn't afraid to express them. "I appreciate your honesty," Thomas replied. "I'll be equally honest with you. I came here because I need the inheritance to build a life for myself. But I don't want to force anyone into marriage. If you're not comfortable with this arrangement, I'll find another way to handle the situation." Ayana tilted her head slightly, considering his words. What do you know about my people? She asked. Thomas felt his cheeks redden. Not much, I'm afraid. I've heard stories, but I'm not sure which ones are true. I know your tribe worked closely with my uncle, and that's given me hope that we might find common ground. At least you admit your ignorance instead of pretending to know us, Ayanna said with what might have been the beginning of a smile. That's better than most white men who come here. Chief Running Bear watched this exchange with approval. Ayanna has been learning English from the missionary's wife for several years. She also knows our traditional ways and the ways of your people. She would be able to help you understand both worlds. Thomas found himself genuinely curious about this confident young woman. What do you do in your daily life? What are your interests? Ayanna seemed pleased by his question. I help my mother with traditional crafts and medicines. I also keep the books for some of our trading relationships with white merchants. Your uncle taught me about numbers and business records. I enjoy learning new things and solving problems. As they continued talking, Thomas realized that Ayanna was probably better educated than many women he'd known back in Boston. She asked him intelligent questions about his carpentry skills, his plans for the sawmill, and his willingness to learn about forest management from her people. The conversation lasted for over an hour, with Chief Running Bear occasionally adding his own thoughts or clarifications. Thomas found himself relaxing as he talked with Ayanna. She had a quick wit and a practical way of looking at problems that appealed to him. More importantly, she didn't seem to hate the idea of marrying him, though she was clearly taking the decision seriously. Finally, Ayanna stood up and walked a few steps away, looking out into the forest as if seeking guidance from the trees themselves. When she turned back to face Thomas, her expression was thoughtful but determined. I will marry you, she said simply, but I have conditions we must agree on before the ceremony. Thomas leaned forward, his heart racing with both hope and nervousness. He had expected Ayanna to either accept or reject the marriage proposal outright. Her willingness to negotiate terms showed him once again that she was unlike any woman he had ever met. I'm listening, Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. What are your conditions? Ayanna glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly, then looked back at Thomas with serious eyes. First, I want to continue helping my people with their business dealings with white traders. This is important work that helps prevent my people from being cheated. You cannot forbid me from doing this. Thomas nodded immediately. That sounds like valuable work. I would never try to stop you from helping your family and community. Second, Ayanna continued, our children must learn both ways of living, your customs and mine. They should speak both English and our tribal language. They need to understand both worlds to survive in the changing times. This condition made Thomas think about a future he had barely dared to imagine. The idea of having children with this remarkable woman both thrilled and terrified him. I think that would be wise, he said. Children should know their full heritage. Third, I want to learn more about running the sawmill business. Your uncle promised to teach me before he became sick. If we are to be partners in life, we should be partners in business as well. Thomas was amazed. Most women he knew back east had no interest in business matters, yet Ayanna was asking to be involved in the most important aspect of his new life. I would welcome your help, he said sincerely. You already know more about this area and its people than I do. And finally, Ayanna said, her voice becoming softer, I want us to promise to be honest with each other, even when the truth is difficult. Marriage should be built on trust, not just convenience or obligation. Thomas felt a wave of respect for this thoughtful young woman. Her conditions were not demands for luxury or power, but requests for dignity and partnership. I agree to all of your conditions, he said. And I have a condition of my own, if you'll hear it. Ayanna raised her eyebrows in surprise. What is it? I want us to take time to truly get to know each other before the wedding, not just a few days, but several weeks. We should be friends before we become husband and wife. If either of us feels uncomfortable during this time, we should be free to end the engagement without shame. Chief Running Bear smiled broadly at this suggestion. This shows wisdom beyond your years, Thomas Miller. Rushing into marriage without understanding each other would help no one. Ayana considered his proposal carefully. How long are you thinking? The lawyer said you must marry within 6 months of your uncle's death. That gives us perhaps 3 months remaining. What if we spend 2 months getting acquainted, then have the wedding ceremony? That would still meet the legal requirement, and give us time to be sure of our decision. I find this acceptable, Ayana said, and Thomas noticed she was almost smiling. During this time you should learn about our customs and traditions. I will teach you some of our language, and you can tell me about your skills with woodworking and business. Over the next few days, Thomas moved from the inn to a small cabin that had belonged to his uncle, located on the edge of both the white settlement and the tribal lands. This allowed him to spend time with both communities and begin learning about his new environment. Ayana visited him every morning, bringing breakfast and beginning his education about life in the Oregon Territory. She taught him which plants were safe to eat, how to read weather signs in the forest, and the proper way to greet tribal elders. In return, Thomas showed her the basics of carpentry and explained how his uncle's business operated. Thomas was surprised to discover how much Ayana already knew about the sawmill. His uncle had indeed been teaching her about the lumber business, and she had a natural head for numbers and planning. She could calculate board feet of timber faster than Thomas could, and she knew which types of wood were most valuable for different purposes. The big pine trees near the river are perfect for building ships, she explained one afternoon as they walked through the forest together. Your uncle sold many logs to the boat builders in Portland, but the oak trees on the hillside are better for furniture and barrels. Thomas found himself genuinely enjoying these daily lessons and conversations. Ayana had a quick sense of humor and wasn't afraid to laugh when he made mistakes trying to pronounce words in her language. She was patient when teaching him but also direct when correcting his errors. No, she would say with a giggle when he mangled a pronunciation. You just said, I am a confused squirrel, instead of, good morning, try again. The people in town watched this unusual courtship with great curiosity. Some were supportive, especially those who had known and respected Thomas's uncle. Others whispered their disapproval when they thought Thomas couldn't hear them. He tried to ignore the negative comments, but they still stung. Margaret, the innkeeper's wife, became one of Thomas's strongest supporters. Your uncle was the finest man I ever knew, she told him one evening when he stopped by for dinner. If he trusted that girl and her people enough to make this arrangement, then you should trust his judgment too. Besides, I've seen how she looks at you when you're not watching. That's not the look of a woman being forced into marriage. This comment made Thomas's heart skip. He had been trying to read Ayana's feelings toward him, but her culture's customs were different from what he was used to. She was always polite and friendly, but he couldn't tell if she was developing real affection for him or simply being kind to her future husband. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to notice small changes in how Ayana interacted with him. She started arriving a few minutes early for their daily meetings as if she was eager to see him. She remembered small details about things he had told her and asked follow-up questions about his life in Boston. When he struggled with a particularly difficult phrase in her language, she would move closer to help him, and he noticed she didn't step away as quickly as she had in the beginning. Thomas realized he was falling in love with this intelligent, kind and strong woman, but he wasn't sure if she felt the same way about him. The question of whether their marriage would be one of convenience or genuine affection remained unanswered, and with each passing day, it became more important to him to find out. 6 weeks into their courtship, Thomas woke up to find Ayana sitting by his cabin door, looking worried and upset. This was unusual because she normally arrived cheerful and ready to begin their daily lessons. When she saw him, she stood up quickly and brushed dirt from her dress. There's trouble, she said without her usual morning greeting. Some men from the territorial government arrived yesterday. They're asking questions about our land agreements and saying that marriages between white settlers and Native Americans might not be legally recognized. Thomas felt his stomach drop. What does that mean for us? I'm not sure yet. My father is meeting with these officials this morning and he wants you to be there. They need to understand that this marriage is part of a legitimate business arrangement, not just some romantic notion. As they walked toward the tribal village, Ayanna explained what she had learned from listening to the adults' conversations the previous evening. The territorial government was under pressure from new settlers who wanted access to more land. Some politicians were claiming that business partnerships between white settlers and Native Americans gave the tribes too much power and influence. "They're trying to find ways to break the agreements that men like your uncle made with our people," Ayanna said, her voice tight with anger. "If they can prove that marriages like ours are not valid, they can claim that your uncle's business deals were not valid either." Thomas reached out and touched her arm gently. "We won't let that happen. Your father is a smart man, and I'm learning that you're even smarter. Together, we'll find a way to protect both our communities." Ayanna looked at him with surprise and gratitude. This was the first time Thomas had spoken about their relationship as a true partnership, rather than just a business arrangement. She squeezed his hand briefly before they continued walking. The meeting was held in the largest lodge in the village, with Chief Running Bear, several tribal elders, and 3 stern-looking government officials seated around a central fire. Thomas was nervous, but he tried to project confidence as he took his place beside Ayanna. The lead official, a thin man named Commissioner Bradley, got straight to the point. "Mr. Miller, we understand you're planning to marry this Indian woman, to inherit your uncle's property. We need to clarify whether such a union would be recognized under territorial law." Thomas stood up, drawing himself to his full height. "Commissioner Bradley, I'm planning to marry Ayanna because she's an intelligent, capable woman who would make an excellent wife and business partner. The inheritance was simply what brought us together." "But surely you understand the complications this creates," Bradley continued. "Mixed marriages are problematic for maintaining proper social order. Perhaps we could arrange for you to inherit the property without this unnecessary complication?" Chief Running Bear spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Commissioner, this marriage represents a peace agreement between our peoples. My daughter is not a complication. She is an educated woman who has been helping to manage successful business relationships for several years." Thomas felt a surge of courage. "With respect, sir, I've spent the last 6 weeks getting to know Ayanna and her family. They are honest, hard-working people who have been nothing but fair in their dealings with white settlers. This marriage is what I want, not just what I need for the inheritance." One of the other officials, a younger man named Peterson, looked through some papers. "The problem is, Mr. Miller, that if we don't recognize your marriage, then any children you have won't be considered legitimate heirs. This could create legal problems for your business in the future." Ayanna had been listening quietly, but now she stood up and addressed the officials directly. "Gentlemen, I can read and write in both English and my tribal language. I keep accounting records for several local businesses. I understand forestry and timber management better than most men in the white settlement. What exactly makes me unsuitable as a wife for a businessman?" Commissioner Bradley looked uncomfortable. "Miss, it's not a matter of your personal qualifications. It's about maintaining clear distinctions between white and Indian communities." "Why?" Ayanna asked simply. "What benefits does separation bring that cooperation cannot provide better?" The question hung in the air, and Thomas realized that none of the officials had a good answer. They were operating on assumptions and prejudices rather than practical considerations. Thomas decided to take a different approach. "Commissioner, may I show you something?" He pulled out a ledger book that Ayanna had helped him organize. "These are the financial records from my uncle's business over the past 3 years. Look at the profit margins from his timber sales, the low rate of theft or vandalism at his mills, and the quality of work from his employees." The officials examined the numbers, clearly impressed despite themselves. "These are exceptional results," Peterson admitted. "They're exceptional because my uncle worked with the tribal community instead of against them," Thomas explained. "Chief Running Bear's people protected his property, provided skilled workers, and helped him locate the best timber. In return, he paid fair wages and shared profits. This marriage will continue that partnership." Ayanna added, "I have also been learning about banking and contracts from your own lawyers and merchants in town. Mr. Wilson at the bank has been teaching me about credit and loans. Mrs. Patterson at the general store has been showing me how to manage inventory and suppliers. Your own people have been helping to educate me." This information seemed to surprise the officials. They had apparently assumed that Ayanna was an uneducated woman who would be entirely dependent on her white husband. Chief Running Bear pulled out his own set of documents. "Commissioners, here are the agreements we have made with 7 different white settlers over the past 10 years. None of them have ever broken their word to us, and we have never broken our word to them. This record of honor speaks for itself." The meeting continued for 2 more hours with both sides presenting their arguments and evidence. Thomas found himself speaking more passionately than he ever had in his life, defending not just his right to marry Ayanna, but her value as a person and partner. Finally, Commissioner Bradley conferred quietly with his colleagues before announcing their decision. "We will allow this marriage to proceed, but it must be performed by both a tribal ceremony and a Christian ceremony conducted by a licensed minister. Both ceremonies must be properly documented and witnessed. This will ensure that the union is recognized under all applicable laws." Thomas felt relief wash over him, but he also noticed that Ayanna looked thoughtful rather than simply happy. After the officials left, he asked her what she was thinking. "I'm grateful that we can marry legally," she said slowly. "But I realized something during that meeting. You defended me and my people with real passion. That wasn't just duty or politeness. You were genuinely angry when they treated us as inferior." Thomas nodded. "I was angry. You and your father have shown me more respect and kindness in 6 weeks than some people I knew for years in Boston. The idea that these officials consider you somehow less worthy than other women is insulting." Ayanna smiled, and Thomas saw something new in her eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Thomas Miller, I think I'm beginning to love you, not because I have to marry you, but because of who you are becoming." Thomas felt his heart leap. "And I know I love you, Ayanna, not because of any business arrangement, but because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met." As they walked back toward his cabin, both of them felt that their relationship had crossed an important threshold. What had begun as a practical arrangement was becoming something much deeper and more meaningful. The wedding preparations began immediately after the government officials gave their approval. Both communities threw themselves into planning a celebration that would honor both traditions and create lasting memories for everyone involved. Thomas had never seen such cooperation and excitement around a single event. Ayanna's mother, a gentle woman named Morning Star, took charge of preparing the traditional tribal ceremony. She and the other women began crafting special clothing for both the bride and groom, using the finest materials available. Thomas was amazed to learn that his wedding outfit would include a shirt made from soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of his journey from Boston to Oregon. "Each bead represents a day of your travel," Morning Star explained as she worked on the design. "The blue beads are for the ocean voyage, the green ones for the forests you passed through, and the red ones for the courage it took to come here and marry someone from a different world." Meanwhile, Reverend Matthews, the settlement's preacher, initially expressed reservations about performing a Christian ceremony for a mixed marriage. However, after meeting with Thomas and Ayanna together, his concerns faded. He was impressed by their obvious affection for each other and their serious commitment to making their marriage work. "I've seen plenty of white couples marry for money or convenience," he told his wife privately. "These 2 young people genuinely care about each other and share common values. That's more than many married couples can claim." The date was set for the first Saturday in October, when the autumn leaves would provide a beautiful backdrop for the ceremonies. The tribal ceremony would be held in the morning in the forest clearing where Thomas had first met Chief Running Bear. The Christian ceremony would follow in the afternoon at the settlement's small wooden church. As the wedding day approached, Thomas found himself growing more nervous and excited with each passing day. He had written a long letter to his mother in Boston, explaining his decision and describing Ayanna in detail. He hoped she would understand and eventually come to accept his choice, even though he knew it would be difficult for her. 3 days before the wedding, an unexpected visitor arrived at Thomas's cabin. Jake Morrison, his old drinking companion from Boston, had somehow managed to make the long journey west. Thomas was shocked to see his childhood friend standing at his door, travel-stained and exhausted but grinning broadly. "Jake, how on earth did you get here?" Thomas exclaimed, embracing his friend. "I got your letter about the wedding and I couldn't let you go through this alone," Jake explained. "Besides, I was curious to meet this Indian princess who managed to capture the heart of Thomas Miller." Thomas was touched by Jake's effort to be there for his wedding, but he was also worried about how his friend would react to Ayanna and her family. Jake had been one of the people warning Thomas about the dangers of Native Americans when he first decided to come west. The next morning, Thomas introduced Jake to Ayanna, watching nervously for his friend's reaction. Jake had clearly expected to find a primitive, barely civilized woman. Instead, he met someone who greeted him in perfect English, asked intelligent questions about his journey, and demonstrated a quick wit and warm sense of humor. "She's not what I expected," Jake whispered to Thomas when Ayanna stepped away to get them some water. "What did you expect?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "Someone more like the wild Indians in the newspaper stories," Jake admitted, sheepishly. "She seems more educated than half the women back in Boston." Later that day, Jake accompanied Thomas to the sawmill to see the business he would be inheriting. Ayanna came along to explain the operation and showed Jake the accounting records she had been maintaining. Jake was amazed by the complexity and profitability of the enterprise. "Thomas, you're not just getting a wife," Jake said privately. "You're getting a business partner who actually knows what she's doing. Back in Boston, you'd have to hire an accountant and a secretary to do what she does." On the evening before the wedding, both communities held separate celebrations in honor of the upcoming union. The tribal gathering featured traditional dancing, storytelling, and the sharing of special foods that held ceremonial significance. Thomas participated as much as his limited knowledge of the customs allowed, and he was moved by how warmly the tribe accepted him as Ayanna's chosen husband. The settlement's gathering was more subdued but equally meaningful. The townspeople had prepared a feast and gathered to offer their blessings to the couple. Even some of Thomas's initial critics had come around after seeing how happy and confident he had become during his courtship with Ayanna. Margaret, the innkeeper's wife, stood up to make a toast. "I've watched Thomas Miller change from a scared young man into someone ready to build a life and a business in our community. And I've watched Ayanna become not just his bride, but his true partner. Together they're going to make our whole area stronger and more prosperous." That night, Thomas lay awake thinking about how much his life had changed in just 2 months. He had come west expecting to marry a stranger out of necessity and hoping to make the best of an unfortunate situation. Instead, he had found love, respect, and a true partnership that he never could have imagined. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and crisp, with golden sunlight filtering through the autumn leaves. Thomas dressed carefully in his new traditional clothing, admiring the beautiful craftsmanship of Morningstar's beadwork. Jake helped him adjust the deerskin shirt and moccasins, shaking his head in amazement at the intricate details. "You look like you belong here," Jake observed. "I never thought I'd see the day when Thomas Miller from Boston would be wearing Indian clothes and looking completely comfortable in them." As Thomas walked toward the forest clearing for the first ceremony, his heart was full of gratitude and anticipation. He was about to marry a woman he truly loved, begin a life he was excited about, and join 2 communities in a way that would benefit everyone involved. When he saw Ayanna approaching through the trees, dressed in a stunning white deerskin dress, decorated with wildflowers and intricate beadwork, Thomas knew that this unusual arrangement had turned into the greatest blessing of his life. The look of joy and love on her face told him that she felt the same way. Chief Running Bear began the traditional ceremony with words in both English and the tribal language, ensuring that everyone present could understand the vows being made and the commitments being undertaken. The morning sun seemed to bless their union as they exchanged promises to honor each other's cultures, support each other's dreams, and build a life together based on trust, respect, and genuine affection. 2 years after their wedding, Thomas and Ayanna Miller had become the most respected couple in the entire Oregon Territory. Their marriage, which had begun as a reluctant business arrangement, had blossomed into a love story that changed how 2 different communities viewed each other. The sawmill business had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Under Thomas's mechanical skills and Ayana's business knowledge, they had expanded to 3 different locations and employed over 40 workers from both the white settlement and the tribal community. Their integrated workforce was so successful that other business owners began copying their model. When I first heard about this marriage, I thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever seen, admitted Samuel Wilson, the local banker. Now I send other businessmen to study how Thomas and Ayana run their operation. They've figured out something the rest of us were missing. What made their success even more remarkable was how they had changed the attitudes of people who had initially opposed their union. Commissioner Bradley, the government official who had questioned their marriage's validity, had become one of their strongest supporters after seeing the economic benefits their partnership brought to the region. The Miller operation employs more people, produces higher quality lumber, and generates more tax revenue than any other business in the territory, Bradley reported to his superiors. Their marriage has created a model for successful cooperation between different communities. Thomas and Ayana's home had become a gathering place where people from both cultures came to socialize, conduct business, and resolve disputes. Their weekly dinner parties were famous throughout the area, featuring foods from both traditions and conversations in multiple languages. Jake Morrison had decided to stay in Oregon after the wedding, fascinated by the opportunities he saw in the growing territory. He had started his own carpentry business and often worked alongside Thomas on larger projects. The transformation in Jake's attitudes had been remarkable to witness. "I used to think all Indians were dangerous savages," Jake confessed to a group of newcomers one evening. "Then I met Ayana's family and learned how wrong I was. Now some of my best friends and business partners are from the tribe. I was the savage one, savage in my ignorance and prejudice." The most dramatic change had occurred in the relationship between the white settlement and the tribal community. Before Thomas and Ayana's marriage, the two groups had lived near each other, but rarely interacted beyond basic trading. Now they collaborated on major projects, shared resources during difficult times, and had even established a school where children from both communities learned together. Ayana had been instrumental in creating this educational program. She served as both teacher and translator, helping white children learn about forest survival skills while teaching tribal children to read and write in English. The mixed classroom had initially worried some parents, but the results spoke for themselves. "My son knows more about this land and how to live safely in it than I ever did," said Martha Henderson, a settler's wife, "and the Indian children are learning skills that will help them succeed as the territory grows and changes. Ayana has given all our children advantages they never would have had otherwise." Thomas had also grown far beyond what anyone could have expected. The nervous young carpenter from Boston had become a confident leader in the community, respected by both cultures, and frequently called upon to mediate disputes or advise on important decisions. His willingness to learn tribal customs and language had earned him a level of trust that few white settlers ever achieved. "Thomas speaks our language better than some of our own young people," Chief Running Bear often told visitors. "He understands that respect must flow both ways if communities are to prosper together." But perhaps the most significant development was the arrival of Thomas and Ayana's first child. Little Mary Running Bear Miller was born in the spring of their second year of marriage, and her birth created a celebration that lasted for 3 days. The baby represented hope for the future, and proof that people from different backgrounds could create something beautiful together. "She's going to grow up knowing the best of both worlds," Ayana said as she held her daughter. "She'll never have to choose between being white or Indian. She'll simply be herself, and that will be enough." The birth had also brought an unexpected visitor to Oregon. Thomas's mother, Elizabeth Miller, had finally overcome her fears and made the long journey from Boston to meet her daughter-in-law and granddaughter. Her arrival had been tense at first, but Ayana's warmth and intelligence quickly won her over. "I spent 2 years worrying about my son living among savages," Elizabeth admitted tearfully on her last day of the visit. "Instead, I found him married to one of the finest women I've ever met, living in a community that most places back east could learn from. I was the one who needed to be civilized." The success of Thomas and Ayana's marriage had inspired other cross-cultural unions in the territory. 3 more couples had married across community lines, and several business partnerships had formed between tribal members and white settlers. The model of cooperation they had established was spreading throughout the region. Word of their success had even reached back to Boston, where newspapers wrote articles about the remarkable experiment in Oregon, where different races were living and working together peacefully. Some writers used their story to argue for better treatment of Native Americans throughout the country. On their second wedding anniversary, Thomas and Ayanna hosted a celebration that drew people from hundreds of miles away. Government officials, tribal leaders, business owners, and families came to honor the couple whose marriage had become a symbol of what was possible when people approached each other with respect and open minds. As Thomas looked out at the crowd of friends and neighbors gathered in their yard, he marveled at how much had changed since that frightening day when he first received his uncle's letter. He had expected to inherit a business and endure a marriage of convenience. Instead, he had found love, purpose, and a community that had embraced him completely. "Do you ever regret the choice you made?" Jake asked him during the party. Thomas looked over at Ayanna, who was laughing with a group of women while little Mary slept peacefully in her arms. "Not for a single moment," he replied. "I thought I was making the biggest sacrifice of my life. Instead, I made the best decision I've ever made." The community that had once been shocked by the idea of a white man marrying a Native American woman now pointed to Thomas and Ayanna Miller as proof that love, respect, and cooperation could overcome any barrier. Their marriage had not just succeeded, it had transformed an entire region and created a legacy that would influence generations to come. Years later, when territorial historians wrote about the early days of Oregon, they would describe the Miller marriage as the event that taught two different peoples how to become one community. What had started as a forced arrangement between strangers had become a love story that changed the world around them.